Let's create a new project and name it as Audit Sampling. Before we start, let's make sure that we save all the files we need in the project folder. Let's go to the project folder. And here, I'm going to save the files that I provide in Canvas, copy them, and then paste into the project folder. Here we have the sample selection wizard, the working paper, and the population data. The population data is a CSV file, and it contains the raw transactions that we are going to take a sample. In the sample selection wizard, we have parameters that can guide us to select the sample. And here are some important parameters. Here we have the upper limit and the lower limit. So if any transaction has an amount above the upper limit and below the lower limit, the transaction will be regarded as a key item, and the key item transactions will be selected in our sample. For the rest of the transactions that are non-key items, we are going to randomly select 25 of them. And we also have the parameters of the name of the client, the account name, and also the period end date. So this is the sample selection wizard. For the working paper, this is where we document our samples selected. So we are going to copy-paste the samples selected in this section in the tab of sample selection. And we are going to fill out the blanks about the client name, the period ending, and some summary statistics of the population and the sample that we select. In the second tab of the working paper, we are going to document the sample selection criteria from the sample selection wizard. So we're going to take a screenshot from the sample selection wizard and paste that picture in this area. Now that we save all the files in the project folder, we can go ahead and start to configure our automation. In this project, since we have many steps of the automation, we are going to use a flowchart instead of a sequence for the entire project. So now let's go to the activities and search for the activity of flowchart. And let's drag and drop a flowchart into the blank space. Now we can double-click the flowchart to go inside this flowchart. Here you see that we have the starting point for the flowchart. Now let's begin by configuring the basic structure of our automation. First, let's drag and drop a sequence below the Start button and connect them. Let's rename our first sequence as Get Data from Sample Selection Wizard. In this sequence, we are going to configure activities to obtain the parameters from the sample selection wizard, including the client name, the period end, the upper and lower limits, and the number of random transactions to be selected. And the parameters obtained from this sequence will be used in the following sequences. Now, let's use another sequence and put it after the first one and connect the two. And let's rename the second sequence as Document Sample Selection Criteria. In this sequence, we are going to take a screenshot of the sample selection wizard and paste that screenshot to the working paper. Now, let's drag and drop another sequence and put it below the second one and connect them. For the third sequence, let's rename it as Import Population Data. In this sequence, we are going to obtain data from the population data CSV file, and from there, we are going to select our sample. Now, drag and drop another sequence below the third one and connect them. And let's rename the fourth sequence as Select Sample. In this sequence, we are going to select all the key item transactions, which have the transaction amounts above or below the limits. And also, we are going to select 25 random samples from the non-key item transactions. Let's drag and drop another sequence below the Select Sample sequence and connect them. And let's rename our last sequence as Input Additional Details in working paper. In this sequence, we are going to fill out the blanks about the client name, the period end, and the descriptive statistics of the population and the sample that we select in the working paper. So far, we configured the basic structure of our automation or our flowchart. Now let's go into each sequence and configure the detailed activities. Let's start with the first sequence. To go inside the sequence, let's double-click it. Now, we are going to use Excel automation to obtain the parameters from the sample selection wizard. To have a better idea of what cells do we need, let's open the sample selection wizard. Here, we are going to read from cell B5 to get the client name, B7 to get the account name, B9 to get the period end date, B11 for the upper limit, B13 for the lower limit, and B15 for the number of random transactions. So let's use an Excel application scope. And let's use the workbook path as sample selection wizard.xlsx. And let's use a sequence of read cell activities. Since we have 6 parameters to read, let's use 6 read cell activities. And make sure that you use the read cell from the Excel automation. Now, let's change Sheet 1 into Data Inputs, because the name of the tab is Data Inputs for Sample Selection Wizard. And we can change the sheet names for all the following read cell activities. Now, let's get the parameters one by one. First, we are reading from cell B5 to get the client name. And let's go to the output and create a new variable named client name to save the parameter from B5. And then we are reading from cell B7. And let's create a variable named account name. Then we are going to read from B9 and create a new variable named period end date. And then B11. And let's save it as upper limit. Next, B13. And let's save it in lower limit. Lastly, B15. And save it in non-ran trans, representing number of random transactions. Now let's go to the variable section, and you can see that these are the variables that we just created. And here we want to change the scope into the entire flowchart because we will use them in other sequences. Okay, so now we have created variables and saved the values of the parameters in the corresponding variables. Now we want to take a screenshot of the sample selection wizard and save that screenshot to our clipboard so that later we can paste the image in our working paper. To do that, we first want to maximize our Excel because in that way we can capture a better picture of the sample selection wizard. So let's first use an attach window activity and put it after the last read cell activity. And let's indicate the sample selection wizard. Now, let's use a maximize window activity and put it inside the do box. Next, let's search for the activity of take screenshot and put it after the maximize window and indicate the element inside window. Here you see that different cells are highlighted. but we want to select the range of the entire sample selection wizard. To do that, you just need to right-click and hold it, and then you will see that you will be able to select a range. So here, I am selecting this entire range of the sample selection wizard. Now, in the Take Screenshot activity, let's create a variable named screenshot to save the image that we just captured. And also, let's go to the variable section to make sure that the variable that we created, screenshot, is there. And let's change the scope to flowchart. Now, let's collapse the attach window activity. After the attach window activity, we want to use some VB coding to save the screenshot to our clipboard. And to do that, we need to use an invoke method. So drag and drop an invoke method after the attach window activity. In the target type, let's select the drop-down list and then browse for types. Here, let's search for clipboard. And let's select the clipboard from system.windows.forms.clipboard. Now, for the method name, let's type setImage. On the right-hand side of the parameters, let's click the three-dot button of the parameters. Now, click Create Argument. And then you will see that the direction is in. For the type, let's change string into image and go to Browse for Types and type image. And let's get the image from system.drawingImage. For the value, we are going to use the screenshot that we just created. Click OK. Now, save our work. So far, we have completed our first sequence of getting data from sample selection wizard. Now let's go back to our flowchart. And let's go to our second sequence. Double-click it. And here, we are going to document our sample selection criteria in the working paper workbook. So to do that, let's also use an Excel application scope. And for the workbook path, we are going to use working paper.xlsx. Now let me open the working paper spreadsheet. Here, we are going to paste the screenshot to the second tab named Sample Documentation. So we are going to paste that picture around here. First, we need to select or activate a cell where we want to paste the image. Let's say we want to paste the image starting from cell A3. So next, we are going to use an activity named Select Range. Let's change the sheet name into Sample Documentation. The range will be A3 in quotation marks. This means we are going to activate A3 and then paste the picture here. So next, we are going to use send hotkeys. And we are going to send the hotkey of Control V because that means pasting the picture. And we want to save the workbook. Now, let's save our work and test whether the bot is working till now. And before you run the bot, make sure you close all the Excel workbooks. Now, let's give it a try. Okay, so you see that the automation, the bot, can take a screenshot of the sample selection wizard and paste it to the second tab of the working paper. And because we are going to run the automation later, I'm going to delete the screenshot here and save it. Now let's go back to our flowchart. Till now, we configured activities in the first two sequences. And now let's continue with our third sequence, import population data. First, double-click it. Inside the sequence, we are going to get all the transactions from the population data CSV file. Since the population data is a CSV file, we are going to use the activity named read CSV. File path is population data.csv. And here, let's create a new variable named dt_pop_data to save the population data. Next, let's generate two summary variables to describe the population data. The first one will be the total number of transactions, and the second one will be the total dollar amount of the transactions. To do that, we are going to install a package named Balareva. So let's go to the Manage Packages and go to the section called All Packages and search Balareva. And let's browse for the data table activities. Here, balareva.data table activities. Click on this and install. Save. And go back to the import population data. Here, we are going to use the count activity and sum activity of the Balareva data table activities. First, search for count. And you will see that the count activity from the Balareva package is shown here. So let's drag and drop this activity after read CSV. Now for the property, in the column name, let's use ID in quotation mark. Because here we are going to count the transactions by ID. As you can see, the ID here in the population data is a unique identifier for each transaction. Here, the input table will be dt_pop_data that we just created that saved the data from the population data CSV. Here, in the output, let's create a new variable named num_total pop transaction, which represent the number of total transactions for the population data. Now, let's search for the activity of sum. And here you see the sum activity from the Balareva package is shown here. And let's drag and drop after the count. Here, in the input, we are going to use amount in quotation mark. Because here, we want to take a sum of all the dollar amounts of the transactions. Now, for the convert input column, let's select double, because the amount is in the format of floating numbers, meaning they can be integers and they can have decimals. So here, let's choose double. And for the input table, it's also going to be the dt_pop_data. Now for the output, let's create a new variable named total amount pop. This will represent the total dollar amount of the population data. And similarly, let's go to the variable section, and we can see the three variables that we just created. And let's also change the scope into flowchart. Now we completed the third sequence. Let's go back to the flowchart, and we are going to configure activities for the select sample. Let's double-click, and inside the select sample, let's first create two sequences. For the first sequence, let's name it as select key items. For the second sequence, let's rename it as randomly select non-key items. So in the first sequence, inside the select sample sequence, we are going to select the transactions whose amounts are either above or below the limits, and these are key items. In the second sequence, we are going to randomly select from the non-key items a subsample of 25 and include them as the sample that we select.